In Chinese folklore, there are whispers of spirits who do not simply haunt at random, but instead seek replacements among the living. They are called Taai Ngui, replacement ghosts, and their stories carry a weight of dread that has echoed through generations. To believe in them is to believe that fate can be stolen, that a life can be claimed in exchange for another's release. In the crowded heart of Hong Kong, where high-rise housing estates stand like silent witnesses, such tales do not feel distant. They slip through the cracks of daily life, lingering in the shadows of narrow corridors and dim stairwells. This is where we find Xias, a young woman in her 20s whose life seemed to be unfolding with promise. She had a career, a new home, and a future brimming with possibility. But beneath her ordinary days waited something unseen, something that would turn her world into a waking nightmare. When Xias stepped out of the elevator that evening, the 9th floor looked identical to all the others. The dim fluorescent lights hummed overhead, throwing a greenish tint against the cement walls, and the long corridor stretched out endlessly on both sides, lined with apartment doors that all looked the same. The public housing estates of Hong Kong carried an atmosphere that was both familiar and unnerving. They were practical, built to house thousands, but their uniformity left little room for warmth. For someone who had grown up around them, the hallways carried a particular weight, an echo of footsteps that seemed louder than they should, shadows that stretched just a bit too long beneath the flickering lights. To Xias, it was a scene she had walked into many times before, but this time, something about it felt heavier, as if the very air inside the building carried stories that weren't entirely human. Mei Li's apartment, like most in the block, was small and narrow. A metal gate stood in front of the wooden door, a barrier both practical and symbolic, meant to keep intruders away, but also to protect the family from unwanted spirits, a common practice in many older Hong Kong homes. Inside, the rooms were pressed close together. The living room was little more than a square of space, dominated by a bulky floral sofa that sagged slightly in the middle from years of use. Against one wall stood a dining table, pushed tight to make way for the narrow walkway that led to 2 cramped bedrooms at the back. The floor was tiled with a beige speckled pattern that had grown dull with time, while the walls bore the faint yellowish stains of years of cooking. A ceiling fan spun lazily above, its rhythmic hum mingling with the faint smell of stir-fried vegetables and salted fish that clung to the air. Xias had known this place for years. She had grown up visiting Mei Li after school, sitting on that same old couch, sharing secrets over bowls of instant noodles. The familiarity should have brought her comfort. Yet as she slipped off her shoes and stepped inside, there was a sense of something unspoken lingering between her and the family. It wasn't the apartment itself, but the people inside it. Mei Li greeted her with the easy warmth of a childhood friend. Despite their differences, Xias, the ambitious scholar turned ophthalmologist, and Mei Li, who had never cared much for academics and now worked part-time at a bubble tea shop. There was a bond between them that had survived the years. Xias respected that bond, even cherished it. Yet beneath the surface, she often sensed the comparisons others made, and nowhere was that more apparent than in the gaze of Mei Li's mother. Mei Li's father was simple in his ways. He sat at the dining table that evening, reading glasses balanced low on his nose. the crinkle of a newspaper in his hands. He was a quiet man, more interested in the newsprint than in conversations of ambition or success. His nod of acknowledgement when Sia arrived was polite, even warm in its own restrained way. He never interfered much, neither openly supportive nor dismissive. In many ways, he seemed like a man who had long ago accepted the small, steady rhythm of his life. Meili's mother, however, was another story. She bustled about the kitchen with her loud voice carrying easily into the living room. Outwardly, she was always welcoming, smiling brightly whenever Sia came by, insisting she stay for dinner, calling her niece in the polite Cantonese way. Yet Sia could not shake the feeling that behind every smile lurked something sharper. Over the years, small comments had given her pause. When Sia shared that she had earned a scholarship, Meili's mother would chuckle and say something like, "Well, books can't teach you everything in life." When Sia mentioned her new apartment, the woman pursed her lips and remarked, "Oh, that area. It's not really considered the best neighborhood." They were always small things, subtle remarks delivered with a casualness that made them easy to dismiss, yet they accumulated like pebbles in Sia's chest. It wasn't open hostility, but it was unmistakably envy. Sia knew that Meili's family had struggled financially for years. Their apartment, though tidy, bore the signs of a life lived without luxury: worn furniture, cluttered shelves, the constant hum of a fan instead of air conditioning. By contrast, Xia's own life had taken a different path. Through hard work and discipline, she had built a career, bought her own apartment, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had carved out a better future. To Meili's mother, that contrast must have felt like a mirror held too close to the face, one that reflected not only Xia's success, but her daughter's shortcomings. And so, beneath the warm greetings and family dinners, there was tension. Xia never mentioned her achievements anymore. It was easier to stay quiet, to avoid those subtle jabs disguised as casual conversation. She told herself it was out of respect, to keep the peace. But deep down, she wondered if there was something darker at play, a quiet resentment that had been brewing for years, masked behind the surface of friendship. That evening, as Sia sat on the sagging floral couch beside Meili, she noticed the small details she had long overlooked. The way Meili's mother glanced at her when she thought Sia wasn't watching, the faint edge in her voice when she asked about Xia's work. Meili laughed easily, oblivious or perhaps simply accustomed to her mother's ways, but Xia felt it more keenly now than ever. It was as if the walls of the small apartment carried not only the smells of cooking oil and mothballs, but also the weight of unspoken jealousy. Hong Kong's housing estates were more than just buildings. They were containers of countless human dramas, of families pressed together in close quarters, of secrets and resentments simmering just beneath the surface. And within this cramped ninth-floor unit, Xia was beginning to sense that what lingered in the air wasn't only the heaviness of old walls, but something far more personal. She could not have known then how deep that undercurrent ran, or how dangerous it might become. To her, it was simply an uncomfortable feeling, one she pushed aside as she smiled politely and joined the family for dinner. But in the dim glow of the fluorescent lights, with Meili's mother's sharp gaze resting just a little too long on her, The stage was being set for something far more sinister than Xia could have imagined. That night at Mei Li's apartment had felt completely ordinary. Dinner had been simple but comforting, the kind of meal Xia had shared with Mei Li's family countless times before. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. The ceiling fan pushed the air in sluggish circles, and the muffled sounds of television chatter filled the small living room. Everything about the evening seemed familiar, even predictable, until Xia stood up to leave. She thanked Mei Li's mother politely for the food, adjusted the strap of her handbag, and turned toward the door. It was in that ordinary motion, that split-second glance toward the living room window, when her entire world cracked open. The 9th-floor window looked out over the empty space between buildings, a rectangle of dim, greenish glow framed by cement walls. Xia's eyes caught movement, and instinctively she turned her head. What she saw froze her blood. A figure drifted across the glass, slow but steady, as though gliding just inches outside. The shape was unmistakably human, but it was not just any stranger, it was her. The face staring back at her was Xia's own, pale as death, expressionless, eyes fixed directly on her. It wasn't a reflection, not with that angle, not with the way the figure moved from left to right, detached from her own body. For an instant, time seemed to hold its breath. Her chest tightened, her pulse hammered in her ears, and her legs locked as though cemented to the tile floor. She didn't scream. She couldn't. The air had been sucked out of her lungs, leaving only a silence that seemed heavier than the concrete walls around them. Mei Li's voice faltered mid-sentence, her eyes darting to Xia's frozen expression. Then Mei Li turned to the window too, followed by her father and mother. But by the time their eyes reached the glass, the figure was gone. Only the shadowed glow of the opposite housing block remained. Xia's skin prickled with cold. She swallowed hard and forced her trembling lips to speak. "I saw something," she whispered, her voice thinner than she intended. "Someone outside. It looked like me." Her words hung in the air like a curse. Mei Li frowned, confusion painting her face. "What do you mean it looked like you?" "Like a reflection." She leaned toward the window, peering out into the night, searching for an explanation. Her father scoffed softly, shaking his head as he folded the newspaper with exaggerated calm. "Nonsense. We're on the 9th floor. You girls let your imaginations run wild. It must have been the television light or maybe a trick of the glass." His tone was dismissive, almost amused, as though brushing off the fear in Xia's eyes could erase what had just happened. But Mei Li's mother didn't laugh. Her gaze had sharpened the moment Xia spoke. She set down her chopsticks with deliberate care, her eyes locking on Xia with a weight that made her stomach turn. Unlike the others, she didn't question or deny it. She simply believed, and her silence carried more gravity than any scoff or confusion. Xia wished she could dismiss it, wished she could cling to the father's rational explanation, but deep down, she knew. There had been no balcony, no ledge, no possible place for a human being to stand outside that window, and the face, that hollow, lifeless face, had been too exact, too precise to be an illusion. She tried to steady her breath, but her hands trembled as she clutched her bag tighter. Then Mei Li's mother broke the silence. Her voice was steady, low, and serious in a way Xia had never heard before. "Tomorrow," she said, "you come with me. I'll take you to see someone. The words seemed to land like a verdict. Mei Li blinked, startled, while her father muttered a complaint under his breath. But Mei Li's mother didn't waver. Her eyes stayed fixed on Xia, heavy with something unspoken, knowledge perhaps, or suspicion. It was as if she recognized what Xia had seen, as if she already knew the shape of this darkness. Xia wanted to protest, to shake her head and laugh it off, but her body betrayed her. She nodded faintly, the image of that pale doppelganger still burning behind her eyes. That night, as she left the apartment and made her way home, the memory replayed endlessly. The way the figure's face mirrored hers exactly, yet without warmth or life. The way it glided silently, its gaze unblinking. It was not a dream, not her imagination. Something had looked at her through that window, and whatever it was, it had worn her face. She thought of Mei Li's confusion, her father's skepticism, and her mother's grim silence. Each reaction only deepened her unease. Doubt wrestled with dread, but dread always won. By the time she reached her own door, her resolve had weakened. She would go with Mei Li's mother. She had no choice, because if she didn't, she feared that pale reflection would not stay behind the glass forever. That encounter at the window became the moment that divided Xia's life in two. The ordinary days before, and everything that followed. Until that night, she had never thought much about ghosts, never questioned the invisible threads of belief woven through Hong Kong's crowded streets and aging towers. But once you see your own face floating outside a 9th floor window, you can never look at the world the same way again. That night, Xia could not shake the image of the pale reflection she had seen outside Mei Li's apartment window. The figure with her own face drifting across the 9th floor glass replayed in her mind over and over, as if her eyes refused to believe what she already knew deep down. It was impossible, and yet it had happened. Mei Li tried to laugh it off. Her father scoffed in disbelief, but Mei Li's mother remained unusually serious. With a hushed tone, she insisted that Xia accompany her the next morning to see someone she trusted, a Taoist priest who, she claimed, had dealt with these matters before. The following day, the city streets of Hong Kong were already alive with the morning rush. But Xia felt a strange heaviness as she followed Mei Li's mother through the narrow lanes toward an aging housing block near Shek Kip Mei Station. It wasn't a temple marked by lanterns or incense smoke, nor was it a shop that offered fortune-telling in the open. Instead, it was an ordinary residential tower, identical to the thousands of public estates scattered across the city. Its cracked paint and dim hallways carried the familiar scent of damp concrete, fried food, and old incense smoke, ordinary to anyone else, but somehow foreboding to Xia. They climbed to the 7th floor and stopped in front of a nondescript apartment door. It looked no different from the others. A metal gate with a red cloth charm taped to the bars, its edges curling with age. Mei Li's mother rang the bell, and soon the door creaked open. Xia expected someone robed in ceremonial clothing, perhaps a man with a long beard like the Taoist masters she had seen in old films. Instead, she was met by a rather ordinary man, middle-aged, dressed in a plain white polo shirt and black slacks. His face was unreadable, neither welcoming nor unkind. Without a word, he gestured for them to enter. The moment Sia stepped inside, her senses were struck by the clutter. The small living room was overflowing with objects she could not identify. Wooden statues coated with dust, tarnished bells, brittle scrolls stacked in corners, and an altar crammed with idols and talismans. A faint haze of incense lingered in the air, mixing with the mustiness of a home that rarely saw sunlight. It did not feel like a residence so much as a storage space for forgotten relics of rituals past. She felt uneasy, as if each item in the room carried its own unseen weight. The priest directed her toward a wooden chair set in front of a heavy desk. Meili's mother began explaining what had happened the night before. Xia's sighting of the floating figure with her own face, the chill that had fallen across the room, the shock that had left her pale and frozen. The priest listened quietly, nodding with a slow rhythm, his eyes never leaving Sia. Then, with a gravelly voice, he asked her for her Sisi, the exact date and time of her birth. Sia hesitated. It seemed like an oddly personal question, yet in her culture, it was common for fortune tellers to request this information. Still, she felt a flicker of doubt. She gave it anyway, speaking softly, as if her own words betrayed her. The priest scribbled the details onto a yellow slip of paper, his brush strokes sharp and deliberate. Then he lit a single stick of incense, closed his eyes, and began to chant. The sound was low, almost a whisper at first, then rising and falling in a cadence that seemed to pull at the air itself. He moved with practiced gestures, waving the incense over the paper, folding it into precise creases, then holding it over a small clay pot where it burned to ash. Sia sat stiffly, hands clasped together, unsure if she was supposed to bow, pray, or simply watch. Her pulse thudded in her ears, drowning out the chant. Finally, the priest exhaled, set the ashes aside, and looked at her with calm detachment. "All is fine now," he said simply, as though brushing away a shadow from her path. Then he slid an empty red envelope across the desk toward her. There was no discussion of cost, no mention of a set fee, only the silent expectation that she would know what to do. Xia felt a pang of unease. She slipped a modest amount of cash into the envelope, bowed slightly, and placed it back on the desk. The priest accepted it without acknowledgement, tucking it beneath a stack of talismans. The transaction felt less like gratitude for help rendered and more like a subtle obligation, as though she had just entered into an agreement she didn't fully understand. When she left the apartment, the bright daylight outside was almost jarring. The ordinary sounds of children playing in the courtyard and vendors shouting from the street seemed unreal after the heavy silence of the priest's cluttered home. Meili's mother, however, appeared satisfied, as though the matter had been settled. She reassured Xia that the ritual was enough, that she had nothing left to fear. But Xia could not silence the unease within her. The ritual had been too vague, too abrupt, and she could not shake the image of the red envelope sliding across the desk, as if it were less about protection and more about payment. Most of all, she regretted giving away her Sisi so easily. In her heart, she remembered the old warnings. Never share your date and time of birth with someone you do not fully trust. That knowledge, in the wrong hands, was said to hold power over your fate. As she walked back through the narrow corridors of the estate, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above her, Xia realized that what had just occurred might not have ended her troubles. Instead, she feared it might have been the very act that bound her to something far darker. That night, after her unsettling visit to the Taoist priest, Xias tried to return to normal life. She had brushed the memory of the flickering incense smoke and the strange chanting aside, convincing herself that the ritual had put an end to whatever had been following her. But the unease lingered, like a shadow clinging to the edge of her thoughts. When Mei Li invited her to stay over after their late dinner, Xias agreed without hesitation. It was late, and her new apartment was far across town. What harm could there be in one more night under the roof of a childhood friend? As they walked back to Mei Li's apartment block, the city around them seemed quieter than usual. The streets, normally humming with midnight energy, were strangely still. The fluorescent glow from the overhead lights bathed the pavement in a sickly hue, and the silence pressed in close. Halfway along their path, Xias suddenly felt the tug. At first it was faint, just a subtle pull on the hem of her shirt. She paused, brushing at her blouse, assuming her handbag strap had caught on the fabric. But the sensation returned, this time unmistakable, a steady downward drag, as though invisible fingers had latched onto her shoulders and were pulling, insisting she stoop lower, step slower, yield to something unseen. The air thickened around her, heavy with a pressure that reminded her of being deep underwater. Her heartbeat quickened. She glanced at Mei Li, but her friend kept talking casually, oblivious to the strange presence pressing down on Xias. For the remainder of the walk, the tugging persisted, rhythmic and deliberate, a silent weight urging her toward the ground. Not until they crossed the threshold into Mei Li's building did the sensation abruptly vanish, leaving Xias shaken and confused. Back inside, the apartment was dim, the only sounds the whirring of the ceiling fan and the muffled noise of Mei Li's parents already asleep in their room. Xias tried to shake off the unease. She placed her bag on the sagging couch and excused herself to the bathroom for a quick shower. Closing the door behind her, she welcomed the warmth of the running water, hoping it might wash away the uneasiness that had trailed her from the street. But as steam filled the cramped space, the atmosphere shifted again. At first, it was a fleeting heaviness in her chest, the kind of pressure one feels before an oncoming storm. Then, slowly, her thoughts began to change. Dark whispers threaded through her mind, alien and intrusive. They weren't her own. She had always been a determined woman, focused, grounded, happy with her life. She had her dream career as an ophthalmologist, loving parents, and her own apartment purchased through her hard work. Yet here in the shower, with warm water cascading down her face, a tide of despair rose suddenly and violently, whispering that none of it mattered, that perhaps she didn't deserve to live. Her gaze drifted, almost without her will, to the metal scissors resting on the soap rack. They were ordinary scissors, meant for trimming hair, but in that moment they shimmered with a terrible purpose. Her hand reached for them as though guided by someone else. She spread the blades open and pressed them against her palm. Blood welled instantly, bright and startling, mingling with the water running down the drain. Yet she felt no pain, only a numb detachment, as if she were floating outside her own body, watching another version of herself carry out the act. For a long moment, She stood in that trance, the metal warm in her hand, the weight of unseen hands pressing her deeper into despair. But then, as if something inside her snapped awake, Xia jolted back to herself. She gasped, dropped the scissors with a clatter against the tiles, and staggered out of the shower, trembling violently. Wrapping a towel around her shaking body, she pushed open the bathroom door. Meili was waiting outside, alarm etched on her face as she noticed the blood seeping through Xia's fingers. She hurried to fetch a first aid kit, gently binding the wound in silence. Xia's voice trembled as she whispered what had happened, how the thoughts weren't her own, how she had felt compelled to hurt herself. Meili's eyes darkened with worry, but neither of them knew what to say. That night, Xia lay on a thin mattress beside Meili's bed, but sleep offered no refuge. When exhaustion finally pulled her under, the nightmares came. She found herself in the dim glow of her own clinic's examination room, the smell of antiseptic sharp in the air. A woman sat in the chair opposite her, a patient she did not recognize. Middle-aged, well-dressed, but with an unsettling stillness. Xia instructed her to read the letters on the vision chart, but the woman remained silent, her lips curling into a smile that was far too rigid, far too wide. Her eyes never blinked, fixed intently on Xia's face. The air grew colder. Xia's stomach twisted as unease spread through her. Then the woman began to laugh, softly at first, then louder, until the sound filled the room like an echo inside her skull. As the laughter rose, the woman's features began to change, her chin narrowing, her eyes reshaping, her mouth stretching, until Xia was no longer looking at a stranger at all. The face across from her was her own, pale, unblinking, and grinning with a terrible joy. It laughed at her with a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Xia jolted awake in Meili's apartment, drenched in cold sweat, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. The ceiling fan hummed above her, the room dark and silent, but the echoes of the laughter still rang in her ears. She pressed a hand to her bandaged palm, feeling the dull throb of the cut, and realized with dread that whatever she had seen, whatever force had tugged at her and pushed her into despair, was not finished with her. That night marked the moment Xia understood she was no longer just an observer of strange phenomena. She was caught in something far darker, something determined to claim her. Xia thought that after the priest's ritual, everything would finally return to normal. But the unease never left her. The phantom face she had seen outside Meili's apartment, the strange heaviness that followed her, and the scissors in the bathroom. These were not coincidences. Her life, once so steady and grounded, now felt as if it had been cracked open by something unseen. She couldn't talk to her parents about it. They were practical people who believed more in medicine than in old spirits. But when she sat across from a close friend during a dim sum lunch, pouring out every detail from the floating face to the trance in the shower, her friend did not laugh or brush it aside. Instead, her friend leaned forward, her voice lowering, and told her plainly, "Xia, this isn't normal. You've been caught by something unclean. I know someone who can help." That afternoon, Xia followed her through the busy streets of Kowloon Tong, their footsteps carrying them past noodle shops, fruit vendors, and the steady noise of city life. Yet with each step, Xia felt more and more detached, as if she were walking underwater. The air pressed against her lungs, thick and heavy. Finally, they stopped before a grey housing block, ordinary in every way, one of hundreds scattered across Hong Kong. Nothing about it suggested mysticism or danger, but her friend told her that inside lived a woman who was not a priest, not a monk, not even officially recognized in any religious order. Yet locals swore she had sight into things most could never perceive. The moment Xias stepped through the old apartment door, she understood why. The air inside was different, stale yet charged, and her vision blurred at the edges. It felt like slipping into a dream. Her ears rang faintly as though she had walked beneath deep water. The old woman sitting by the altar hardly moved. She was thin, her grey hair pinned back neatly, her eyes sharp and unblinking. She looked straight at Xia, and before Saya could speak, the woman murmured, "You're being followed. A woman clings to you, and she did not find you on her own. Someone guided her." Xia's breath caught in her chest. She had said nothing, yet this stranger spoke the very fear she had been too afraid to form into words. Her friend urged her to sit, and Xia obeyed, trembling. The old woman's hand was warm as it pressed against her shoulder. She told Xia to close her eyes and think carefully. Where had she been these past few days? What places had she entered that were not her usual paths? Xia forced herself to retrace each step. Mei's home, the quiet walk back through the estate, the dim corridor of the priest's apartment. When she whispered this last memory, the old woman nodded sharply, as if she had already known. 2 elevators, a trash room on the right, the old woman said. Xia's eyes snapped open. She had not described it aloud, yet the woman pictured it perfectly. Xia whispered yes. Then the question came, almost like a knife. "Did you give him your CZ?" Xia's stomach dropped. In Chinese culture, CZ, your date and hour of birth, is considered deeply personal. It is believed to contain the essence of your fate, a map of your destiny. She remembered writing it down for the Taoist priest, thinking it was harmless, a formality for the ritual. Slowly, she nodded. The woman's expression darkened. "Your information was not kept safe," she said. "It was placed beneath another paper, another person's details. That person is no longer among the living. You have been tied beneath her fate, made her substitute. The spirit is bound to you now, trying to pull you into her place." Xia felt the blood drain from her face. She tried to argue. How could such a simple act, just writing down her CZ, carry such weight? But the old woman explained that in certain folk practices, this was called Tai San, the substitute body. Normally, it could be used in protective rituals to absorb misfortune on behalf of someone. Paper dolls or straw figures could carry illness or curses away once burned. But in darker hands, it became a weapon. A malicious practitioner could take a living person's CZ and bind it to that of the dead, creating what was known as a Taai Ngui, a replacement ghost. The words chilled Xia more than the scissors ever had. A replacement ghost, the woman explained, was the spirit of someone who died unjustly, violently, or by their own hand. Such souls were restless, unable to reincarnate, trapped in a loop of their death. The only escape was to replace themselves with another living soul, to trick or force that person to die in their stead. Then, and only then, could the original ghost move on, leaving the new victim trapped in limbo. It dawned on Xia that the pale face outside the window had not been a reflection at all. It had been her own death looking back at her. The old woman continued, her tone heavy with centuries of belief passed through generations. Sometimes these ghosts found substitutes by mistake, attaching to someone who resembled them in fate. But often it was through human hands, jealousy, hatred, or desperation, that the bond was forced. Someone had delivered Xia's CZ into the wrong hands, stacking her name beneath that of a wandering ghost. The priest had completed the binding, and the spirit, hungry for release, had been trying to drag Xia into the same despair. Xia's mind raced to Mei Li's mother, her sharp words, her envy veiled in politeness. Could it have been her? Had she led Xia to that priest on purpose, offering her as the scapegoat? The thought twisted Xia's stomach, but before she could fall deeper into fear, the old woman gave her shoulder a firm squeeze. "You are not lost yet," she said. "The bond can be broken." The next hour blurred into chants, incense, and the crackle of burning talismans. The old woman worked with calm precision, her voice steady as smoke filled the small apartment. Paper dolls were burned, names rewritten and torn, the ties severed piece by piece. Xia sat frozen, her wounded hand throbbing, her mind caught between dread and relief. Finally, the woman whispered, "It is done. You are free. But remember, never give your CZ again, not to anyone you do not fully trust. It is your fate, your shadow, your life. In the wrong hands, it can be used against you." When Xia stepped back out into the noise of the city, the air felt lighter, her chest less heavy. But she knew something fundamental had shifted. The world around her still looked the same. Grey towers, flickering street lamps, the steady hum of traffic. But now she understood how thin the veil between the living and the dead could truly be, and how dangerous envy and superstition could become when mixed together. She would never forget the lesson. In Asia, fate is fragile, and sometimes the people you trust most are the ones who put you in harm's way. The apartment was dimly lit, its air thick with incense that clung to Xia's skin and hair. She sat tensely on the narrow wooden chair, her wounded hand wrapped in gauze, trembling not from pain, but from the dread of what she had come to understand. The old woman before her, stooped with age, her eyes sharp with an unsettling clarity, had just revealed a truth that chilled Xia to the bone. Someone had taken her CZ, her birth date and hour, and placed it beneath another name inside a Taoist ritual. That act had tethered her to a restless ghost, a woman who was not simply wandering, but actively trying to claim Xia's life as her own escape. The old woman wasted no time. She moved slowly, yet deliberately across the cluttered apartment, gathering objects from shelves stacked with ancient trinkets and yellowing talisman papers. A brass bowl clanged as she set it on the table. Beside it, she laid thin sheets of joss paper, each marked with red ink symbols that seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. A stick of sandalwood incense burned low, filling the room with its smoky sweetness. But beneath that, Xia detected something sharper, like iron, like blood. "Sit still," the woman said firmly, her Cantonese laced with an authority that made Xia obey without question. "Do not speak unless I ask you to. The spirit is near, and it listens." Xia's chest tightened. She folded her hands in her lap, knuckles white, as the old woman struck a match and lit another bundle of incense. The thin smoke curled upward, twisting unnaturally, as though stirred by a presence no one could see. Chanting began, low and rhythmic, her voice a murmur that seemed older than her years. Each syllable rolled like a wave, carrying with it an invisible weight. She drew a talisman in the air with her finger, her movements swift and precise, before pressing the paper against Xia's forehead. At once, Xia felt a searing heat pulse through her skin. Her eyes watered. A pressure built behind her temples, as though something inside her was resisting, clawing, refusing to let go. Her breaths came shallow, uneven, until the woman's chanting grew louder, commanding, filling every corner of the room. The brass bowl rattled on the table. The incense smoke thickened, coiling downward instead of up, forming a haze that seemed alive. Xia's vision blurred. For a moment she thought she saw the faint outline of a woman's face forming in the smoke. Her own face, pale, with that same lifeless smile from her nightmare. A shiver cut through her, and she squeezed her eyes shut, whispering a prayer under her breath, though she wasn't even sure who she was praying to anymore. The old woman struck the rim of the bowl with a wooden stick, the sound sharp and resonant, vibrating through the air. She began tearing the talisman papers, burning them one by one in a clay pot. Flames licked hungrily at the edges, and the ashes rose, scattering like black snow. Between each burning, she spat a quick incantation, her voice cracking yet unyielding, as if she were arguing directly with the unseen. Then came the dolls, 2 small effigies made of straw and cloth. The woman pressed one into Xia's hands. "Hold it tightly," she instructed. Xia obeyed, though the texture of the straw against her skin made her stomach twist. The old woman took the other doll, marked it with ink strokes, and bound its chest with a thin red string. Her chanting surged again, faster now, each word striking like a drum beat. The air in the room turned icy. Xia's breath came out in puffs of white. A sudden force pressed against her chest, heavy and suffocating, as though unseen hands had wrapped around her ribs. Her fingers convulsed around the straw doll, and she nearly dropped it. The old woman slammed her palm against the table, shouted a command, and burned the second doll in the clay pot. The moment the flames consumed it, the crushing weight lifted from Xia's chest. She gasped, sucking in air as if she had been underwater. The old woman stepped forward, resting a warm, surprisingly steady hand on Xia's shoulder. "It is done," she said softly, her voice losing its edge of command. "The cord is cut. She cannot follow you anymore." Xia sat trembling, her body light yet hollow, like a vessel that had been emptied. She wanted to believe it was over, but a part of her still feared looking over her shoulder. The woman, sensing her unease, leaned closer. "Listen to me," she said. "You were careless. Never again give away your Xizi. Not to a priest, not to a friend, not even to family you do not trust. Your date and hour of birth hold your fate, your path, your very life. In the wrong hands, it can bind you, curse you, or worse, replace you. The one who held it had power over you, and that is why the spirit could cling so strongly." Xia's throat tightened. She thought of Meili's mother, her sharp words, her constant comparisons, the jealousy veiled behind her smile. Could she have done this? Or was it all the priest's doing? She had no answer, only questions that gnawed at her heart. The old woman continued, her eyes grave. Do not go back to that priest. Whatever his reasons, he used you, and he placed you in danger. If you return, the door will open again, and this time, it may not close. The warning sank into Xia like a blade. She nodded, too shaken to argue. The old woman pressed one final talisman into her hand, folded neatly in red paper. Keep this with you, she instructed. It will protect you for a time, but protection begins with you. Be cautious. Be silent about your fate. Some doors, once opened, can never be shut. As Xia left the apartment, the morning sun was rising, painting the public estate in muted gold. The heaviness that had haunted her for days seemed to lift, replaced by an eerie stillness. Yet her mind churned with unease. She knew she would never see the world the same way again. She had glimpsed the hidden strings that tied the living to the dead, and she understood now how fragile those strings could be. From that day forward, Xia carried not just the talisman, but the weight of the old woman's words. She never again spoke of her hour of birth. She never returned to Mei Li's apartment, and though the laughter no longer haunted her nights, a quiet fear followed her always. The fear of what might happen if someone, somewhere, ever learned her secret again. Even now, Xia has never truly found peace in what happened. The memory of that pale face outside the 9th floor window, the strange heaviness in her body, and the laughter of the woman in her dream still linger like shadows that refuse to fade. She sometimes wonders if she was simply unlucky, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, or if there was something darker at work. Was Mei Li's mother jealous enough to hand her over to a priest? Did envy drive her to gamble with another person's fate? Or was it all the doing of a priest who saw opportunity in Xia's Cizi and twisted it for reasons only he understood? These questions remain unanswered, and perhaps that is what makes the story so haunting. The truth hides behind silence. Yet the lesson is clear, passed down through generations. In parts of Asia, your date and time of birth are more than numbers. They are believed to hold the key to your destiny, and in the wrong hands, they can be used against you. So be careful who you trust, and never give away more than you must. If stories like this captivate you, remember to subscribe, share, and join me again for more chilling tales from across Asia's shadowed traditions.